My name is Karan Flanscha. I'm a Cedar Falls resident for many, many years. I have been teaching quilting since 1980. I'm one of the founders of the Keepsake Quilters Guild. I've been interested in quilts since I was a little girl. My mom started me embroidering when I was 4 years old, and I took on all kinds of stitching. My first actual quilt was felt pieces that I made a little quilt for my troll when I was in 2nd or 3rd grade. So my interest goes way back. Unfortunately, I didn't inherit a lot of family quilts, although there was some quilts and some quilting in my family. So I had to learn to quilt so that I could make my own. What do I do with Grandma's quilt? The most important thing that I can tell you is do no harm. There's a well-known quilt historian named Xenia Cord from Ohio, and she has a saying that says, if you are considering washing your quilt, go lie down until the feeling passes. You don't want to be responsible for ruining a treasured family keepsake or even a valuable antique quilt. There's a number of things that you should consider when you're deciding how you're going to care for an antique quilt. Is it a museum quality quilt? Is it a family heirloom quilt? What kind of condition is the quilt in? Is the front of the quilt, the fabrics, are those in good condition? The backing of the quilt, is that in good condition? The binding on the edge, is that going to pieces? That's usually the first thing that will get the damage over the years. Are seams coming apart, or are some of the fabrics what they call shattering? They're coming off in bits and pieces. Are the dyes used in them making the fabric, are those color fast, or are they bleeding and fading? So the first thing to talk about is cleaning. The safest way to clean an antique quilt is vacuuming. And that might not be the first thing you'd think of, but one of the things that does the most damage to quilts is actually dust and dust mites. They're sharp little crystals and they damage the fibers of the fabric. So you can vacuum the quilt on a low setting, and it's a good idea to take like a pantyhose or a piece of the fiber screen that you can get at the hardware store and hold that over the end of the nozzle, and then on a low setting, run that just very slowly back and forth, and that will pull out a lot of those dust particles and extend the life of the quilt. You can also take the quilt out on a breezy day. It's not a good idea to hang it on the clothesline. Might seem like a good idea, but all the stress and strain then is on the quilt stitches and the fabrics. So a better idea is to find a safe, shady location, put a cotton sheet down, lay your quilt down, and then another sheet on top of it, just in case a bird would fly over or something, and leave it out, for a day and just let it air. That will remove a lot of odors if you have odors in the quilt, and it's a safe way to take care of the quilt. Do you remember a robot in a sitcom called Lost in Space who would come on the screen and say, "Danger, danger"? That's what you should think of if you're considering wet cleaning a quilt. So any kind of washing. Wet cleaning can ruin a quilt more so than probably anything else. There's a number of ways you can have the fabrics run, the dyes can fade, the fabrics can just shred. That really is a difficult thing for the quilt, and we tend now to think, oh, I'll throw it in the washing machine. Our washers, with the agitation that they have, are very destructive to the fibers, and the detergents that we use today are very corrosive. They'll strip color right out. Some of the chemicals that were used in the dyeing of the fabrics in old quilts are not safe used with the detergents we have today. They can pull the color right out, they can change the color. So wet cleaning is really, really reserved just for something if it's really, really horribly dirty and you just feel you have to do something. If you choose to wet clean, you should put a clean sheet in your bathtub, use distilled water, lay the quilt over the sheet, and just let it soak. Maybe push it a little bit with your fingers, but no strong agitation. Let it soak for maybe an hour, and then use the sheet to lift it out. If the water's really dirty and you want to rinse it a second time, you can do that. Let the water out, then refill it, and do that until the water's clear. Then lift the quilt out, and you want to dry it flat on towels, maybe a sheet on top of it. You can take it outside if you've got a shady place, lay the towels on the grass, and then the quilt on top and then a sheet on top of that, or possibly in the house if you've got a large flat area that's safe, so you can have some fans blowing across it. That's the probably safest way, and you still aren't going to know what's going to happen. You don't know for sure how the fibers will react, both in the fabric and in the batting. I had a student one time who washed a family quilt. Her mother-in-law had given it to her, and she was coming to visit, and she thought she was doing a good thing, and it turned out it had a wool batting. And the fabric came out okay, but the wool all scrooged up, and it was ruined. There's really nothing you can do once that happens. So that's why, danger, danger. Think 3 times about wet cleaning. Then the last thing would be dry cleaning, and that is not recommended for quilts. Dry cleaning uses chemicals, and those chemicals go into the fabric and they never come out. And they are corrosive to the fabrics, and over time will shorten the life of the quilt. Spot cleaning, you may have just one area that has a spot. The first thing you have to think about, as we get a little older, we start having age spots, and quilts will have the same thing. The fabrics will have markings that are could be from off-gassing of woods or where it's stored, things like that. Those you can't change, and so you want to be very careful with spot quilt cleaning. Had someone come to me once with a beautiful antique quilt, and it had just this one spot, and she used a brush and tried to wash it out, and she literally took out a chunk of the fabric. That's another thing that you can't fix. So living with a little spot, maybe you just have to say, this is the age of the quilt, this is part of the beauty of the quilt now. Always test your fabrics first in any kind of cleaning, because it's possible that your dyes could run, that type of thing. So if you use a Q-tip and just rub in one small area, then you could get a feeling if you are safe to maybe continue with any kind of cleaning. Washing machines should be totally avoided. Whether it's a front loader or a top loader, the agitation and the rubbing is very corrosive to the fabric, let alone that we often use hot water, which they would not have used when a lot of the antique quilts were made, and that really strips the colors and can cause the dyes to change. Light damage. Damage from exposure to sunlight and fluorescent light are both very hard on quilts, and light damage is cumulative, so it accumulates over time, and it's irreversible. There's nothing you can do about it. Once the fading has happened, it's just going to stay that way. So as you're displaying quilts or storing quilts, you want to think about how the quilt is being held, stored, at what kind of light source, that kind of thing, so that you preserve the life of the quilt. Photography, flash photography, is also something that can strip color from the quilts. It's just a quick little burst and you don't think much of it. If it's one quilt or one photo, that's not a problem, but if you're having it photographed a lot, that can cause damage to the quilts. Temperature and humidity. Quilts and other textiles do best in conditions that would be comfortable for a human being. You wouldn't keep grandma in the basement or the attic, so you don't want to keep your quilt there either. Temperatures of 62 to 72 degrees and the humidity at 45 to 55% are ideal conditions. Some museums are fortunate to have a climate controlled storage area, and that's great for the quilts. Most of us don't have that at home, so if you keep the quilts maybe in your bedroom where you're comfortable, the quilt will be comfortable too. If the humidity is too low, the fibers will dry out in the quilt, and you can feel in an old quilt the fabric is almost crispy. Sometimes you can rehydrate by maybe having them in the bathroom or in a shower. Don't put the quilt in the water, but just let the humidity kind of come back into the quilt. And if it's too moist, you could get mold and mildew, and again, that's very damaging to the quilt. Storage. The first thing you want to do is a visual inspection for pests before you store the quilt. So you don't want to put a quilt away and then bring it out later and find out that there were moths, beetles, whatever in the quilt. The best advice that I found was, if you bring a new quilt into your collection, especially an antique quilt, and you don't know where for sure it came from, how it was stored and cared for, put it in a completely airtight plastic bag for 2 weeks. and that will kill any insects, larvae, whatever, eggs, so that you can then store the quilt safely. Before you store a quilt, you would want to clean it, so I would say vacuum, and look at it very carefully so that as you're doing your preparation to store the quilt, you're looking for any potential problems. You can lay the quilt flat to store if you're lucky to have a spare bedroom and a bed that you can lay the quilts out and just one on top of another, sort of Princess and the Pea. That's the ideal way to store the quilts. If you don't have that option, there are acid-free storage boxes, archival boxes, acid-free tissue, or a muslin can be kind of crumpled up and put in the folds to prevent creases in the folds. Then if you've got storage area and need to use like a plastic type box, a lot of people are used to the plastic tubs, you can use a number 2 polyethylene or a number 5 polypropylene tub. So look at the plastic, the bottom of the plastic tub, and it'll be marked. And those are more safe, not ideal, but more safe. You don't want to put the lid on tight. You want to leave it cracked open a little bit so that you have some air circulation in there. And what's really, really important is to take your quilts out several times a year, shake them out, look them over, check for any pests or any damage, and then you want to refold them in a different way than how they were originally folded. If the quilt is folded the same way all the time, you're going to end up with permanent crease marks, and you can get a damaged area where the fabric starts breaking along that fold line. When you take the quilts out to refold, then you can look at them and see what kind of condition are they in. Is there something I need to do? Has anything changed? And just enjoy them while they're out. You want to store them somewhere where they're away from direct sunlight or fluorescent light, just to avoid any kind of light damage while they're in storage. Repair. Choosing to repair a quilt is a big step. Doing quilt repair depends on what kind of condition the quilt's in. Also, is it a family quilt and you want to preserve it? One option there, especially if the quilt's not in good condition, is you might want to replicate the quilt. Use the same pattern, maybe even try and find fabrics that are the same color or design print that was in the original quilt, and that way you can have one that can be used and enjoyed and still preserve the antique quilt. If there's the binding on the edge of the quilt has damage, that's probably the easiest thing to replace, but you do want to be careful to find fabrics or colors that are similar to what the original was, so that it is in keeping with the antique quilt. Any repairs that are done today take away the antique value of the quilt. Sometimes people ask about covering patches that maybe have holes in them. They used to use mordants to set the dye, especially black, and they might outline a little tiny design with that black, and now there's holes all over your red patch where that literally fell out. The only real way, well, there's two ways that you could potentially fix that. One is a product called crepeline, which is a very fine mesh. It's usually used for like museum type restorations, and they just base that kind of over the top just to kind of hold what's there in place. And it's very sheer, so from a distance you might not even notice that repair. Another way is to actually applique patches over the top. That is a painstaking, long-term kind of a project. So it depends a lot on the reason that you want to do that, if it's worth that kind of investment in time and money for the materials. Again, you'd want to use fabrics that are very similar to what was on the original quilt so that it is appropriate and doesn't look, from a distance you'll go, oh, look, there's a patch that was put on in 2020 or something, because of the fabrics being different. If you get a quilt top, I get a lot of people ask me, they find quilt tops because not unlike today, people can turn out the quilt top, patchwork or possibly applique, faster than they do the actual quilting. Now we do a lot of machine quilting, and so I think more quilts are getting finished. But I do get people ask, okay, I got a hold of an antique quilt top, can I quilt it? And it really depends on the condition of the fabrics, how well it was stitched. You need to look, because some old quilt tops weren't finished into a quilt for a reason. Maybe they weren't made right, they don't lay flat, things like that. But if the fabric is fragile, you don't want to quilt it. I had a student who hired someone to hand quilt an old quilt top, and she got it back and she washed it in the washing machine, and it all fell apart. The quilting stitches were the only thing that held anything together. So the top really was not in good enough condition to have been quilted. So that's really probably the best idea, is to save those quilt tops, maybe display them occasionally and just enjoy them the way they are. Some quilts were actually made as summer quilts and don't have a lining and batting and backing. So that's a possibility too, that it was really just intended to lay over the top of the bed as a decorative item. Displaying quilts. Quilts add warmth and color to your home. I think they're one of the best ways to add enjoyment. In my house, I have seasonal quilts that I change out periodically. I have some that are out pretty much all the time just because I really like them. They're special. You want to rotate the quilts. If you have the same quilt on display for a longer period of time, you want to turn it if you can. If it's draped over, say, a railing or a sofa, just flip it around the other direction so that you get even wear and light exposure in that on the quilt. You want to be careful, especially with antique quilts, that you don't do any further damage because of how they're displayed. One way you can display is to put a rod pocket at the top of the quilt. And the pocket, you can slide a small wood piece through and use that to hold and support the quilt. I found that sometimes you go to hang a quilt like that and it may not hang nice and straight like you'd like. It may just be that the quilt actually isn't straight, but if you think it should be, you can add a second rod pocket at the bottom and slide another piece of wood or even a small piece of metal, which has more weight, in the bottom. Now that's a short-term thing. I wouldn't leave it out that way, all year, but for a short-term situation, that works really well. Quilt racks are great. You can drape a quilt over that. I've seen people that are getting antique ladders, and they use the ladder, fold the quilt, and they might be able to display 4 or 5 quilts, kind of stacked one on top of the other that way, which gives you a neat visual, and you get to see several of your quilts at once instead of just one at a time. Avoid direct sunlight and fluorescent lighting. Fluorescent is actually worse than direct sunlight for fading fabrics. Documenting your quilts. This is something that's really important to me. I helped with the Iowa quilt documentation back in 1988, and one of the most common questions, we'd have people come in with these wonderful family quilts and they'd say, "What can you tell me about the quilt?" They didn't know, found it in an attic, didn't know who made it, didn't know the age of the quilt, didn't know the name of the quilt pattern. So if you have a family quilt and you know who made it, get that information and get it in writing. There's lots of ways that you can put labels on the back of the quilt. I'm going to show some examples. So the simplest is going to be just using either, you want to use a permanent pen. I've got a Pigma pen and a Perma-Writer 2. Do not use a laundry marker. Those are not permanent and they can bleed into the fabric. You want to make sure you're using an archival type pen if you're writing directly on the fabric. Or you can make a label, which is separate, and then apply that onto the back of the quilt. So the basic information that you want to include is, if you know the name of the quilt or the design, the block that is used, put that on there. If you want to put your the name of the maker, if it was quilted by someone other than the maker, you want to put that on. I have a number of quilts that are gifts from friends. We traded blocks and that kind of thing, so I'll put their names on because they're all part of the story of that quilt. I like to put the date I started the quilt and the date I finished it. Now that on an antique quilt, you're not going to have any idea, but if in the family you have information, you'll get that information down. The location the quilt was made can be helpful for quilt historians. Sometimes there's geographical look to certain quilts. Not as much these days because a lot of our stuff is influenced by magazines and the internet, so we all see the same colors, designs, and that everywhere. In the past, quilt designs tended to be more localized because they'd see what one person did and they'd have access to the same fabrics. Researching this information may pique your interest in quilt history. We're lucky to have some local organizations like our Keepsake Quilters Guild. There is also a group called the Iowa-Illinois Quilt Study Group that meets at the Kelowna Quilt and Textile Museum twice a year, just for the purpose of sharing information and getting to view wonderful quilts in their galleries. There is the Iowa Quilt Museum in Winterset, which has changing exhibits, and the International Quilt Museum is in Lincoln, Nebraska. They have a wonderful online presence, and you can go and lose hours looking through their quilt collection. The American Quilt Study Group is a national group, and because of the pandemic, they have started doing a lot of online things. So they now have what they call quilt snacks on YouTube, which are short videos that they've done similar to what the Cedar Falls Historical Society is doing with our program. And you can go on and just enjoy learning a little facet of quilt history. So for me, the antique quilts came as part of my interest in quilt making. I love learning about the quilt makers in the past, the colors and the fabrics and that kind of thing they used. And that's one reason why taking care of Grandma's quilt is important to me, so that those quilts and their stories will be carried on for future generations.